I just thought of a fun thing to bounce around.
Okay.
How do you think Fred and Larry are gonna make it out of season 4?
So I have a terrible thought, and I hope I'm way wrong.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I mean, if you go back and listen to any of our old episodes, one thing is very clear. We talk a lot about how much we've desperately wanted to see a commander get purged. And my fear is that the commander we're going to see get purged first is going to be Larry.
Yeah,
I don't
we like
feel
him
great
most.
about his chances after that trailer. It's a very ominous walk he's making, and he's just in a very precarious situation. I mean, all signs, I assume, point to him. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Begrudgingly have to agree with you on that. We already know that that the only thing that kept him going in the construct of Gilead was his wife. And now that she is no longer of this earth, and he knows that June had a hand in it, whether direct, even though it was indirect, I still had a hand in it. Larry's kind of team, nothing left to lose.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is why he was willing to facilitate the escape in the first place. You can't have something that high profile happening at your high profile commander's house without someone taking notice and there being repercussions. Right. And for 50 plus children being ushered out of Gilead and flown out under the cloak of night, heads will roll. And I think Larry's is the most likely, begrudgingly. I love him so much and I don't want it to happen. But yeah, I think you're right.
Because I'm trying to remember exactly the details of season 3, but I believe we talked about it pretty recently that the only reason that he would be implicated is because of that Martha who brought Rebecca/Kiki.
And she went back.
She went back.
Yep.
So she would be the one that would say it all went down at his house and therefore he's getting walked in. But I will say that it's kind of interesting. I know that season 3 really opened up the doors of Gilead as a whole country. Like, we hadn't really seen a lot outside of Boston, so seeing DC was very eye-opening and very confusing because we were suddenly very perplexed as to what exactly the power structure is within Gilead, and how does Winslow compare to Fred? I mean, he clearly has more authority, but we were led to believe for a while that, Lawrence and Fred had all this authority and all this, clout, and now Winslow seems to be way ahead of them. Who else is ahead of them? How does this power structure work? If you look back to season 1, we have Fred hosting the Mexican delegation, but why, so it's just a little confusing. And during my rewatch of season 3 this week, that episode, the scene where June is talking to, I think it's the Swedes, but it's definitely like the UN of some sort. It's the neutral party. Is it the Swiss?
Swiss.
Okay. Swiss,
so,
yeah.
So she's sitting down with them, and she's trying to figure out how she can keep Nicole in Canada. But one of the things that one of the representatives says to her is that they really need information on Gilead's power structure, because until they understand how Gilead's hierarchy works, they don't know how to attack it or how to work within it or how to deal with it. And it made me laugh because it was almost like the show's writers showing their hand of like, they purposely keep this very slippery so that we can't pin it down and therefore can't say it doesn't make sense. Because I mean, I can reason away why Fred would host the Mexican delegation instead of DC, but it's just, it's just very strange. And it did make me laugh that they mentioned that, the Swiss mentioned that, they're like, we don't even know how it works. And I'm like, yeah, no kidding. I would love to know too.
That's a really, really good point.
Yeah, so I just don't know who is there, because one thing that we did see in season 3 with Lawrence is that towards the end of the season, with Winslow being dead and Fred being in Canada, Putnam and Natalie's of Matthew, so Commander Matthew, whatever his name would be, Natalie's commander, because he talks about his little baby being, gaining weight. But Putnam and that guy go to Lawrence and they say, we think we can bring you back in. Fred and Winslow are basically, there's a spot open for you to now take control again, Lawrence. And he kind of walks into it. So we just don't know who's ahead of Lawrence to take him out. Like, there's no Cushings, but I'm sure there's other Cushings. There's got to be other people of power. So it's hard for me to say exactly what's going to happen to Lawrence, because I just don't know who reigns above him, and clearly, or who's gunning for him, which would clearly be a lot of other commanders, I would imagine.
Wow.
I love the points that you're making here, and you make a very good point. I want to go back to one point that you said about 2 minutes ago about why. No, sorry,
you to the first paragraph.
I love when you go on those rambles because you just expound so many amazing ideas. So I want to touch on one that like really caught my attention, though, because we were talking when you're talking about the power structure, you mentioned that why is Fred hosting the Mexican delegation instead of anyone else? And then we know we see what's happening in the Capitol, and there's this presumption that this is certainly like the central hub. I think it's because Gilead centralized in the Capitol as we know it now is a bit more volatile and violent of a place. And we see that with the rings. We see that it's a much more austere and much more confined, and definitely rings more true of this sort of fascist regime. It feels very much like a regime. Whereas when you go to Boston, or the former Boston, there is this looming dread. However, it's a much more relaxed, casual environment. You see the handmaids walking around without rings in their mouths. The wives are walking about freely. It seems as though it's a bit more calm of an environment. Because and they're leaning more into that sort of like New England colloquial vibe as well. So that seems like that would make it the perfect place for international delegations to go. They don't want to see the fascism. They don't want to see that portion of the regime. They want to see like the everyday peaceful life and how things can be for the everyman. And by bringing them into Boston Gilead, that affords that opportunity.
It's a great point. I hadn't thought about that at all. Oh, I like that. Just an optics, and it's a different style. Too, while you were bringing that up, I was thinking also that we seem to be under the impression that Cushing's and Price maybe, but definitely Lawrence and Winslow and Waterford, all of these commanders that seem to be the commanders of this new Boston area, former Boston area, they seem to have all known each other prior. So I'm wondering if maybe these were the founders of the Sons of Jacob, and the DC Winslow-esque people are kind of trying to one-up them and be like, anything you can do, we can do better, Boston.
That's an interesting point. I think my only argument against that, though, would be why would Fred then be so nervous to meet with Winslow and be so trepidatious about the trip to the Capitol?
Like, he's already has an established authority.
Exactly. Yeah.
Maybe it's because the Sons of Jacob would have been theoretically, in order to have this kind of takeover, they would really have to have been really in Congress already. So all these DC commanders, they were probably already there. And now they're just the survivors of the Gilead takeover. They're the ones that probably reigned control of that entire, what did they call it? The crucifixion? I don't know.
I think it was
biblical terms. What do they call it that Nick's involved with? The crusade. Nick's involved in the crusade. So during that crusade that Winslow probably like led, it's probably because he was already in Congress to some extent, or DC to some extent. So I see what you're saying. If they probably are the established authority, because DC is just the established authority, period.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Exactly. Yeah,
it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that like the way, the original states are broken up, they probably kind of kept things relatively the same across the board and just considered like each former state a district. So that's Fred's district. He ended up being the lead of that district. Right. And so it's almost like, it's the equivalent of maybe something between a mayor and a governor.
Yeah.
Because they have more, I don't know, I guess more power.
Right. And it's probably like the Sons of Jacob chapters. So this was the Boston chapter, and this is Cushing's and Price and Waterford and all them.
Yeah,
that seems like it's the most accurate, because why the fact that like you do have all of the Bostonians that are super comfortable working with each other, that we see consistently in car rides.
Mhm.
And it's a safe presumption that that same sort of thing is happening in other major metropolitan areas in the capital as well.
Right.
Look at
Which
our
would-
own Capitol riots.
Yeah.
That's exactly, many of those were
Do we have
organized
to?
groups that have chapters, and they
right.
showed up in
Mhm.
mass
Yeah.
to make that
Exactly.
happen. That's like, I mean, Fred, he's such a douchebag that he's kind of like the Gilead equivalent of a Proud Boy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
It makes sense too of why they hold certain commanders to certain esteems. So, because we in season 2, when we're first introduced to Lawrence, Lydia is trying to tell Emily how important this man is. He is the architect of the Gilead economy, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. And Eleanor clearly has a lot of disdain for the fact that he definitely had something to do with building this society.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if these things that are brought up, like him being that architect, are just that one thing that Boston contributed. Like, we have Lawrence and he came up with this whole idea, and you've got Fred the marketer, and hey DC, look what Fred did for you. And it's just that, and it's just their little local. No, you saying
no.
Scarlett?
Actually,
Oh.
I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
Only because I just did this fucking episode.
Yeah, perfect. Tell me about it.
And they address this.
Okay.
Eleanor
Perfect.
goes and like, just attacks Emily and is like, he came up with it all. Like he came up with the colonies. And she says, those are actual people and you're having them dig up poison. It's poison. That's what it is. That was his idea.
Yeah.
So
Wait, that's what I said. No,
that's
yeah, I
Lawrence's
agree.
idea. Yeah.
That's what I mean.
No,
That's
okay. No, the way that I heard that was that you were saying that he wasn't just like, it wasn't like he was just the regional like architect guy, like, for Boston. It was so much more that he contributed.
That's why he's important.
Okay.
Only because of that, not because he's from Boston. I guess that's why I'm saying within
Okay,
Boston,
thank you.
he's such a celebrity because on the grand scheme, he did this very important thing.
Yeah.
Where it's like, that's why no one touches him in Boston, and he kind of does what he does because he has that clout elsewhere. And it's because he's kind of like the star of Boston, but he doesn't really give a shit about any of it. And I think it was more or less inadvertent how he got to where he got to, or maybe not inadvertent, but we don't really understand a lot of how Lawrence got to where he got to, other than he takes a lot of emotion out of it and probably put some numbers down and said, this is how you should do it. And they ran with it.
But I think that we're getting what we're dancing around right now is that the Proud Boys that are hanging out in the Capitol are the brute force behind what's happened. They are the military leaders. They are the ones that have the bravado. And I think that the ones that are hanging up in Boston are the ones with the finesse, the ideas people, the ones that like weren't interested in the glitz and the glamour of being in the Congress as it were before, or perhaps the military as it were before, but like the hypothesizers, the philosophers.
Yes, it's the ideology.
Exactly. And that's why you have the ideologist, you've got Fred, you have your PR person, you have Serena. We don't see anyone with like that forcefulness and with that sort of militaristic attitude until we are in another major metropolitan area. And that stands to reason why why the former Boston then becomes the showstopper, and where they're allowing the cameras to go and where they're hosting people. Like, let the idealistic philosophers be the ones to tout the notions of Gilead to the international arena, while behind the curtain in the Capitol is the real nitty gritty.
Yeah.
It's very North Korea.
Perfect.
It's exactly North Korea. Thank you for saying it. But that's indicative of any sort of totalitarianistic regime, is that they want to have this. They have that one place that they go and they put on their facade and everyone's super happy. And when they ask the handmaids, or they ask the civilians, are you happy with your life? They have the canned, stifled response. In the Capitol, they're not getting that luxury of being even asked, because even if they were asked, they have rings in their mouths.
Mm-hmm.
They're not allowed to answer that question. So for me, it makes perfect sense that there'd be that separate, that delineation.
Yeah.
And there's also a respect in the Capitol for the power that the Freds and the Larrys wield, because they, being the idealists, the idea men,
Right.
and also being the PR masters, are the ones that are allowing Gilead to have any potential for success in the international arena.
Right. Oh, I think we just broke down that Gilead power structure a little more than I thought was possible. That makes perfect sense. Thank you. I like that a lot.